A huge honour to welcome Dr. Charles here to Scotland virtually. He's the coordinator of the Innovative Youth Justice Team at Swansea University and the criminology lead for the Observatory for Human Rights of Children in Wales. And his main research interests are youth justice and the promotion of rights within the justice system. He's the program director for criminology postgraduate taught and teaches across a broad range of undergraduate and postgraduate level work. And so a real expert who's going to give that incredible perspective and experience to us today. And so I pass on to you now, Dr. Charles.
Oh, thank you, Bruce. Let me just put my slides up for you all. Have they appeared? Yep. Good, okay.
No, they've not appeared yet.
Sorry, here we go. I do criminology, not IT, you can see this so clearly. Sorry. Right, here we go. Was that better? There we go, thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce, for that introduction. I cannot really start my talk without just quickly reflecting on what Hannah said a little earlier. What an incredibly moving testimony. And I think I tweeted earlier saying that if we ever needed somebody to tell us why we need to take the UNCRC seriously, Hannah, you've done it. I really, really wish you the very best for your future career, and please keep telling your story. It's super, super powerful and important. As Bruce has said, and you probably noticed in my accent, it's not Scottish, I'm Welsh. I'm from Swansea University. I'm one of the academics down in Swansea, and my main area is children's rights and youth justice. And what I want to try and do today is to offer you some reflections, particularly following the awful year we've had, on the fragility of children's rights, but yet also the way that things are adapting, the way that officers and children themselves are adapting, and also the way that we can move forward now. I see this as a really critical time. In Scotland, as your minister said earlier, it is really, really clear Scotland's on a really positive trajectory. In Wales, we've fallen back a little bit, I think. We were one of the leading nations in the United Kingdom in terms of children's rights. We need now to supercharge and move forward. And I suspect as well, there is an opportunity coming up for the Celtic nations to start working together, because, using the term of the minister earlier, there is a vision that we all agree on, this vision of children's rights. And I'll come on to that a little later. And so I think it's important to begin by having a look at how far we've really got. Now, we're 32 years post agreement of the UNCRC by the UN General Assembly, and 30 years since the UK became a signatory. So in many ways, you might think we should have achieved a lot. And in some ways, we have. However, we still have a great deal to do. And I'm going to adopt a sort of Muller-Rice methodology, if you remember those adverts. A bit of pain first before we get to the pleasure. I think we have to be very critical and very realistic about where we are. Some of that conversation has already occurred this morning. Hannah's statement being a classic one about why we need to do far more. And what I've put there up on the screen are some of the concluding comments from the 2016 periodic review of the United Kingdom by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So focusing there on paragraphs 31 concerned the right to participate, Article 12 rights. We certainly are not doing enough around that. And in terms of youth justice and juvenile justice, are we doing enough? No, we absolutely are not. We're making progress, but I think we have to be very careful not to be complacent. There's always a danger. Children's rights, human rights, they sound like wonderful things, and they are absolutely wonderful things, but we cannot take them for granted. We need to be vigilant. Some of the conversations earlier, Juliet made incredible points about what we need to be doing to keep things under constant review. And there are some enduring challenges that simply are not going away, and we can't brush them under the carpet or hide from them. First of all, there are big problems about what we mean when we talk about youth justice, when we talk about participation, some of these big concepts that we throw around in policy and in legislation. Very often, we don't talk to children about those things. Certainly from the research I've done in South Wales, when we speak to children about participation, they have a markedly different view of what that is compared to adults. And we have adultified a lot of our processes. And we need to move back from that. It's a hard journey, but we need to move back. We still have a focus on criminal justice. I'm one of these awkward people, and Julia talked about Scotland, and I come from a part of the UK that's a bit awkward as well as far as children's rights are concerned, because our devolved administration has made it very clear in Wales that children's rights are important to us. We have a problem around what justice can mean itself. Currently in Swansea, we're doing research with children to try and make sense of what justice actually is. And again, initial findings suggest it's very different to what we see, it's very different to what the system sees. I'm not going to touch on so many of these points below because they are huge issues. The issue of custody. Well, we should be engaging far more in preventative activity, early intervention. We should be looking at community justice. There's a lot of research that supports that, and that is intimately connected with, for example, General Comment 24. It was a real shame that General Comment 24 came out just as the pandemic has kicked in. We also focus a lot on deeds and not need. I think that is deeply problematic, particularly when we have social policy that emphasises children's welfare, when it identifies issues and the need for support around trauma. Deeds are often the symptom rather than the cause. And we have to take a very heartfelt look, actually, at what we're doing to children in the system. We're not often working with them, often doing things to children. And there are other issues as well. We cannot see youth justice and children's rights in the absence of greater societal understandings. Regrettably, within the United Kingdom, in parts of our own nation states, we have significant problems with multiple issues around poverty, inequalities of opportunities, and these things are taking a very long time to sort out. Certainly in Wales, despite us having strong anti-poverty policies, we have a problem with poverty. Part of that is systemic, part of it is systematic, part of that is, again, we need to ratchet up and be honest about what we can do, what we should do. I think as well, after the past year that we've had, we need to take stock. We cannot go back to business as usual. We certainly can't go back to that because so many things have changed. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you two quotes here. And these are, for me, very telling. In Wales, in 2011, the National Assembly for Wales, as it was then, enacted the Rights of Children and Young Persons measure. And that legislation placed due regard on Welsh ministers to have due regard to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in a time of crisis, when a committee of the Welsh Parliament was looking at the implementation of that legislation, primary law, so it should have made a difference, what did we see? Children's rights are not driving the Welsh Government's decision-making as the legislation intended. That's damning. It's very damning. We need to hear that. It's damning. More recently, we've seen in England, the Secretary of State for Education being challenged in the High Court concerning the rights of children in care. I'll go back to this. This is 30 years on since the UK became a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. These things should not be happening, and yet they are. And what it does do is to expose a fragility in terms of children's rights. And I think that fragility has always been there, but COVID has been a crystallizing moment, in my opinion. And we can see in particular vulnerabilities around specific rights and some of the most important rights that children have. First of all, engagement in education. We've seen schools having to shut, and this isn't a critique of government policy in any part of the UK. There's been a health crisis, but we have to deal with the reality that children have not been able to access education the same way that they could, and there are long-term implications from that. There are issues around safeguarding. There's a mental health epidemic, arguably, on the way, and we're not sure if our services can take that at this point in time. Hopefully they can, but we need to reformulate and understand how children in particular have been affected by isolation, by restrictive practices in their communities. And there are wider, more mundane, but equally powerful forces and changes that COVID has created that have impacted upon children, socialization and peer engagement. You know, we know that younger children from articles of research, their socialization has been negatively impacted by being stuck in a certain place for periods of time. And arguably that's affected those who are less wealthy far more significantly than those who have additional resources. And that has created as well stress on families and communities. The places where, in many ways, rights flourish, rights are talked about, rights become real. So what COVID has done is to expose these very serious challenges. And yet, I put this quote on the right-hand side of the page there. The Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights said, although the UNCRC, the UK is a signatory, this doesn't have direct effect in domestic legislation. However, the interpretation of that, it's a matter of international law. We should be doing far more to give effect to principles which, to be blunt, are really common sense. They're progressive, but they are common sense. As I was thinking about today's presentation, and I've been inspired by what's been said earlier as well, I thought I'd resurrect this. It looks like something from Doctor Who, out of Gallifrey. This is something I put together last year when I was doing research with children. We were trying to understand the impacts of COVID on the child, and this concerns education. Now, I think we have to dispel very quickly the concept education is just about teaching and learning. It's absolutely not. Very often schools are those unseen warriors in our communities who do so much to protect children's welfare, to engage in early intervention and prevention, to provide rights-based knowledge transfer, to give children competency, support and help and development. And if you look quickly at that screen, you know, when we look at those 4 issues I've highlighted there, welfare support, learning activities, behaviour and engagement with staff and particularly specialists, the inner circle, if you like, the thicker lines were where we worked prior to COVID in many cases. Schools wrapping support around children. That's been pulled back in the past year. We've got to see that as part of taking stock. We've got to see the mode of service delivery has shifted, and there are consequences of that. We're still not back to where we need to be. We've got to ask ourselves, in that sort of vacuum space beyond those thick lines, what is that doing to our children? You know, when we look at things like the risk factor paradigm, what's that doing? When we look at concerns about welfare and about need, what's that doing? It's a very big question. There's also a stunting, if you like, of whole school and system and early intervention prevention processes. I've put there some pillars. And again, this is reflecting on educational research that I've done, particularly talking to children. Many of our institutions, particularly through local authorities, do the things that are on the screen. They are the places where rights are seen as foundational assets, where children can access their entitlements, where they can have a positive atmosphere, where they can enjoy their culture, be educated, learn, not just in a formal classroom setting, where if there are issues, they can talk to teachers, they can engage in peer models, and where their welfare and well-being is supported. They're not abandoned. But this is so particularly important in areas of poverty. And so by those pillars, we see restorative practice being critical, behaviour support being critical, and the children's voice being heard. Earlier, you know, sorry, going back to Hannah's talk again, just your comments regarding voice. They're so powerful. If we truly believe children are our future citizens, and they are citizens and they're important members of our society, why would we not listen to them? That simply does not make sense. You know, I was thinking about this again earlier when some of the earlier talks were on, and I wanted to pull out a couple of quotes really. I'll give one now where there was, in one school I work with, there's a big support for blending rights approaches with restorative justice. And I want to give you a comment from a primary school child about why this matters, these whole school approaches matter, why they are so significant. And she said, when we sit down in circle time, people get strong and share, and then we all help each other. When people are on their own and they feel frightened and nobody cares, that's when things go horrible. In the class, we help each other out and we're not frightened anymore. That's really moving to me, but it says so much about these progressive rights-based approaches and why we must fight to make sure that they are not minimized as a result of the disruption of COVID. And when we look around the positive activities that do undoubtedly occur, both in Scotland, in Wales, and other parts of the United Kingdom and other countries, what we can see is that there has been significant disruption. Participatory processes disrupted, appropriate interventions and welfare support disrupted, or the mode changed, so it becomes uncertain. There are issues around the learning pathway of children, the rights lifetime, if you like, of children, where they may lose understanding of social codes, of engagement, of the specific rights that they are entitled to. And certainly for us in Wales, somebody mentioned earlier the curriculum. We're about to launch a new curriculum in Wales. We're in the middle of phasing. The Wales curriculum for 2022 places some very serious expectations around the teaching of human rights in schools. Regrettably, what COVID has done is to slow that down at a time when arguably human rights have never been more important. Now I'm going to go to the other side of my Muller-Rice methodology here, which is positives. Is it all doom and gloom? Absolutely not. I've offered my comments to begin with because I think we have to see things as they are. I'm quite a pragmatic person. A lot of my work is done with local authorities, with yachts, youth offending teams in England and Wales, and by service providers. I think we need to see things as they are, otherwise we won't improve things. And what can we say in terms of positive responses? Well, research so far is showing that in the past year, despite the incredible challenges for service providers, youth justice has remained dynamic. And we've seen members of staff adapting to support people. And what I have found so heartening is that actually the officers I have spoken to say we are now focusing on what matters, not what works. It's a different type of paradigm. What matters to that child? How do we resolve that? I am one of these people, again, having worked with yachts for so long, who thinks that we need to trust our officers a great deal more and draw upon their expertise. Social workers are trained with an almost innate ability to see rights. Youth workers are the same. Our public sector staff have an almost innate understanding of rights, and we need to be able to give them the space to apply their knowledge and to create change. And when we do, as we have done, particularly in the last year, because of the disruption, some fantastic things have come out. You know, for example, the third point there, processes implemented, they're more appropriate. You know, we've seen online processes around things such as pre-court systems, where actually a child can stay at home with mum or dad or parent carer. They're not having to go into formal buildings and get frightened. They're more relaxed, able to take the time and talk. With things like the processes we're working with now, children are far better at that than me. You saw me at the start. I can't get my presentation up sometimes. This is the world of the child. And so we've been forced in many ways to engage with that. That's a positive. And in the system of justice, which can be quite horrible at times, that is a good thing. What has been also powerful is that there's been continued development on pro-rights approaches to justice. And I'm going to just flag up here the Wales Blueprint. That which states very clearly it is based on the principles of the CRC and seeks to address trauma. That is moving forward, as also is the blending between devolved and reserved powers in Wales. I'm not going to bore you all with a constitutional law lecture, don't worry, but in Scotland you may be shocked to hear that actually in Wales our parliament cannot pass legislation, direct legislation anyway, regarding criminal justice. We have to rely on Westminster. And Westminster and Wales arguably have a very different approach, but the blueprint has been able to blend some of the best. We've got welfare supporting rights-based social policy powers mixing with youth justice legislation and practices. And I do have to say, because I have to be fair, that the Welsh Government and the Youth Justice Board Cymru are working together rather well. So this is a thing for positive celebration. There's also a reflection really on agencies. Agencies in the last year in particular, I've noticed that they are understanding far better what whole system approaches can do, because people have been forced to work together. The silo approach in many ways has broken down a bit. That's not a bad thing. And there are better understandings of the relationships between related aspects of a child's life. We know, for example, mental health issues are significant at the moment. There's been an emphasis, thankfully, in political discourse on welfare and on anti-poverty measures. And agencies are part of that solution, and so many of them are reacting in a positive way. And there is as well a focus on what I call neo-welfarism, looking at the needs, not the deeds. One final point on the agencies as well. They have acknowledged the fragility, not just of rights, but of services. The last year has been a tremor in the public sector, and agencies have seen that. And my final point in terms of positivity is all of this, based on work we were doing anyway, but it's been accelerated, shows us that there is a pathway to rejuvenation. And that rejuvenation will place rights at the heart of its process and of its policy. I was so moved to hear your minister talking this morning. Things are so exciting in Scotland. We're all watching you at the moment, particularly what happens in the Supreme Court. And I really hope that your legislation remains intact so we can see what a great model you can create up there. But COVID's also shown us that services can be resilient, not just fragile, but resilient. People adapt. So in youth justice practice, for example, we've seen youth work style engagement happening, community engagement, partnerships with parents and families, home visits, better relationships building with children, a disassembling of the standard work model. That's been seen as a positive by both children and workers. We've also now been given space to stop and think. Rather than doing the every day, we've had a chance to stop and think, right, what do we need to tackle? And we can't hide anymore from some of the things that are critical, not just to rights, but to justice. I'm a great fan of semiology, and I won't bore you with that today, but the issue of social harm is when we talk about youth justice and rights, we're not just talking about criminal justice. We need to talk about harms, about the support that people should have, about the way communities are organized. And we cannot hide from poverty and the corrosive effects that has, social inequality. There are so many areas of social inequality we need to deal with. And actually there are creative solutions already in the system that can support children. And we've also seen innovation, particularly at the different levels of society. The devolved administrations are still moving forward with progressive policies and approaches. At a lower level on the ground, the important frontline staff are changing things to make sure systems keep running, that those who need support keep getting it as well. And in terms of research, a great deal of research is happening. And I see this as a chance almost for a renaissance for us to look at rights and how disruption can actually give birth to something stronger. There's also, as well, I'm picking up on what the minister said earlier and other people have reflected, there is an issue of us adopting a common vision. For me, this is the time when we do say across, Celtic nations, hopefully across the United Kingdom, I'm not sure what Westminster will do, that actually we've got to buy into a common vision. I think it's a vision that we already possess about the transformative power of children's rights, and also see in the CRC not being a Woolworths pick and mix bag, show my age there. It's about the entire set of rights in the CRC. If we want to do youth justice properly, we have to do the other rights properly as well. And we've got a way to go. But if we acknowledge that, that's a start. There are also long-term issues around justice. Children are, by their very nature, younger people. They are our future generations. And if they are not treated properly and fairly at an early age, we are storing up trouble for the future. And I make that point not in some sort of weird political defensive comment or some economic argument. We do that because we deny humanity. We deny rights if we don't do things in an appropriate manner. And finally, I want to give you a reflection on this term we use all the time, build back better. When we think about children's rights and we think about youth justice, I actually think we're missing the point. We just need to be better at supporting children, families, and our communities. We need to invest in understanding what children need. We need to be better at that. We need to be better at challenging orthodoxies. Just because things are the way they are does not mean they should stay the way they are. And there's a lot of research evidence and a lot of will around creating change. And then finally, if you're wondering what that image is on the left-hand side, seeing children's rights as a shield, not in a defensive context, but as something that gives children something to stand behind, take their time to develop, to grow, and to flourish. But that shield can't be ripped away. We've seen that in the last year where the shield's been dented quite a bit. We can't allow that to happen. I'm going to finish now on my last slide, just with a couple of reflections. Sorry, I know I'm probably going over. I'm getting a bit carried away. I'm all right, am I? Thanks, Bruce. First of all, there's hope in youth justice and in children's rights. And I think we need to hang on to that hope. It's easy to get despondent. Sorry, Hannah, going back to you again. If I'd known your speech was being done before mine and the nature of it, I probably would have changed some of my slides. If we listen to children and we take seriously what they say, the policy solutions and the service reforms will become easy. There's hope, and we can see some of that flowing through the system now. There is fragility, but there's also resilience. And I'm finding as well, and I know what people, my colleagues in Scotland would say as well, I'm actually finding practitioners getting a bit more vocal about children's rights and about the need for youth support services. You know, in England and Wales, as a part of austerity, so many youth clubs shut, so many services were dragged away from children. And then we have government that criticises children. So that's not really a covenant that works, is it? But we have to be better at protecting rights and supporting those children who come into conflict with the law, and provide appropriate interventions to make sure they don't get dragged down by that system. And my final point is this. I see that there's a real opportunity at the moment with a new Scottish government, a new Welsh government, for us without common vision about rights to work together and to make sure we have complementarity. The last thing we want at the moment is for a silo in Scotland, a silo in Wales, when there are really valuable lessons that we can learn from each other. I'm one of these people who really is not precious about things like this. And I think the more we can work together, hopefully, when the next periodic review comes, we can see significant progress rather than the same old, same old. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles Anthony. That was absolutely brilliant. The strong evidence base that you bring, the passion that you bring, but I'm so pleased that you focused on some of that optimism and how we can channel some of this to do better, and that particular focus on COVID and looking back over the last 16 months and the UN committee warning us of the grave risk to children's rights, what's happened over that period and what we can do to ensure that children's rights and their voices are at the heart of what we do. That shield that you just presented there reminds me of, for the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we asked children to do 7-word stories about what the convention meant to them. And one of my favorites was, "My rights are my armor to me," this kind of understanding that there's a protection element that's got to be there. And the voices of children and young people coming so strongly through your work is an absolute delight. And I had the opportunity to do my first school visit yesterday in 16 months. And it's really, so many of the messages that you talked about were exactly what the young people were saying in terms of value the skills that we've built up, recognize the restrictions that we've had and the impact those have had, and build services with us, around us. And this huge opportunity we've got to combine our commitment to rights and the experience that children and young people and the rest of us have had. For anyone that's worried about time, we're just going to run 15 minutes over as the program, and we're going to cut short the pre-lunch break before the workshop. So the workshops will still start on time, but I am going to ask one quick question of you though, Anthony, if you'd be happy to answer one more, because I think it links very closely with your points near the end there about the role of profession and the question which I've just now lost. Do you think that professionalism and training practitioners and the training that practitioners receive gets in the way of us being human and seeing people first and taking that rights-based approach? Does professionalism sometimes get in the way?
That's a really interesting question. And I offer 2 quick comments on that. The first one is no, in terms of training. Let me deal with that just one little bit of it. I actually think when we look at the curricula for people like teachers and social workers, youth workers, actually what's contained in their training is immensely positive. It's affirming, it's positive, it's inclusive, it's anti-discriminatory. I think the real problem is the frameworks we ask those professionals, who very often when they're trained are enthusiastic, wonderful people who want to create change. We then lock them into service frameworks that stop them from doing those things. I think that's the problem. You know, we look at things like national standards, and it's, sorry to use the word, it's a bit like dumbing down in some reason. We get rid of discretion, we get rid of creativity. So what I would say is, no, I don't think it's an issue of the training. We can always improve training for all of us. But I think it's the issue of what we then ask those professionals to do, and the discretion and the space we give them to respond to the needs of those they work with.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.